is now subjected. The Mediterranean itself, as a small and enclosed sea, is one of the fastest heating places on Earth. It's heating approximately 20 times faster than anywhere else. And mammalian reproductive health survives in a very narrow band of temperatures. We're pretty adaptable, but we don't do heat very well. And bodies that carry their sexual organs on the outside, in the form of testicles, really do suffer terribly with heat. So this delicate question that we needed to ask our Palestinian counterparts, our friends in the West Bank, was around what they were noticing. Were they noticing reductions in mammalian health of themselves or the animals that they look after? And were they willing to talk to us? And they were. And they were noticing all kinds of very distressing things. They were noticing a tremendous decline in males' ability to produce viable motile sperm that can swim properly and fertilize an egg that's available. And they were noticing that young women especially were suffering terribly when they tried to get pregnant. And then once pregnant, they were suffering terribly with the difficulty of carrying pregnancies to term. And they were aware of the incredible expense that families were going to try to address this situation. There were medical support systems that were available to some of them, with large support from families to keep pregnancies and to allow pregnancies to come to term, to have healthy live babies. And they were also noticing that their livestock, the baladi livestock, are precious to Palestinians because they're very, very carefully adapted over generations and generations. Oxen, camels, sheep, goats, the basis of an animal husbandry and an agricultural livelihood that is being rapidly eroded and destroyed through the military occupiers' insistence on the replacement of agroecological, land-based farming methods with ones that rely on fossil fuel-derived fertilizers, herbicides, and other toxins. So yes, they had noticed that they could not stand in the fields any longer and complete their work. They had noticed that the babies that they were having were coming with more difficulty. And they had noticed that their livestock's reproductive capacities were declining. This was the information that we had written up and prepared for presentation to Oxfam Jerusalem, who asked us for this study. And now, 301 days ago, on the 7th of October, we were about to start work in Gaza. Except, of course, we all woke up to the news of the jailbreak. And my astonishment that this could have happened, I still cannot understand how the Al-Qassam brigades breached the wall. I've been in and out of Gaza for several years now, and the last time I was in, I crossed 13 separate checkpoints, all of them highly technologized. None of them with a human being on the other side of them, because there are barricades within barricades and within barricades. The times that you know there might be a human intelligence somewhere around are when you know that a sniper is pointing a rifle directly at you. And sometimes you hear a disembodied voice very rudely telling you to put your identity documents down so that they can check that you are who you say you are. I know people who have fallen down because they're so ill that they can't stand, who've been made to wait for hours in order to cross from Gaza to the very strong medical system that the Israeli occupier has set up, largely as a result of its constant need to heal people who've been injured in the wars that it keeps perpetrating. It is not a simple matter to get into or out of Gaza. And yet somehow the Gazan brigades managed to do that. And through that dreadful Saturday, as I anxiously waited for updates from friends about what might be going on and what might be the consequences of it, I thought, in these strange ways that you do when you're just in a blind panic, I thought, how will we do this research? Odd question. How will we do this research? But that is what I remember about this day, thinking, well, how will we get these precious testimonies from Gaza? How will we explain to people about the sexual and reproductive health results of an ongoing, vicious, militarized, technologized, ecocidal military occupation? So in the next couple of days, as this news kept coming in, I realized that we were not going to be able to do anything like the kinds of research that we had managed to conduct in the West Bank. And I also realized that it probably didn't really matter in quite the same way to talk about heating and reproductive harms, because within a week we realized that the entire medical system was going to be devastated. None of us, I think, could have anticipated quite how ruthless and how vile that destruction of the health system has been, and yet the signs were there. In fact, it was an early precision bombing, of which the Israelis are more than capable. If you haven't noticed, they can be very precise in their targeting when they wish to be. It was a very early precision bombing that took out the largest and most important of Gaza's's 9 fertility clinics. The one in which a precious 5,000 embryos had been frozen for retrieval and hopeful implanting in their mothers at a time when it would perhaps become more possible to have a child. They very precisely bombed this fertility clinic, and it was not accidental. The people whose embryos were stored in those cold centres had suffered for years, many of them, with reproductive harms and terrible fertility and multiple miscarriages. And since then I have seen harrowing scenes of women whose first live child after 5 or 6 miscarriages has been blown up in their arms. This demographic war that we keep hearing about, which is supposedly a war of how many settlers, how many illegal settlers can you thrust into an ancient land that is water scarce and whose fields are less and less fertile, which is less and less viable for human life because of the endless toxicity to which it is exposed. Those precious embryos were represented for many people the potential of a future child. And those were gone. And so, as these dreadful weeks have gone by, our incredible research team inside Gaza decided that they wanted to continue to try to talk to people either way. And we have 6 extremely precious testimonies taken in displacement camps in Khan Yunis and near the Rafah crossing before the intensity of the violations of the last couple of months, where people from Gaza tell us so much that we had not really understood before about what it is like to live with nearly 20 years of enforced military toxicity. And it was astounding how acute people's memories were, where they had been on the day that they first smelt the deployment of white phosphorus. The strong garlicky smell, it's unmistakable. And the fact is that after exposure to white phosphorus, you will vomit and you will pee and you will poo acid that will burn your intestines and your skin. You will feel extremely ill. And you will, if you have been unfortunate enough to be pregnant on exposure, or unfortunate enough to want to have a child within a couple of years, I don't know the duration of it because we don't have longitudinal studies, you will produce babies who are deformed in some way. Your babies will show all the signs of toxic exposure to military effluents. So this is one of the things we've been tracking. How long does this toxic effect of exposure to military systems actually last? The second piece of research that we were forced to start to take into account as we were working on this piece of work was the longitudinal effects on the body of hunger. The longitudinal effects of body on the hunger are something that we, of course, as South Africans are too horribly not familiar with, because we also live in a state of apartheid in which food sovereignty is denied to those who most need nourishment. And you will know, of course, about the Israelis' long and carefully thought through calorie-induced shortages that have included a calibration of precisely how much they believe each human in Gaza needs to survive, and therefore has inflected how much food gets to cross those barricades for maybe 20 years now. There was a massive micronutrient deficiency in Palestine before the 7th of October. And it shows up in painful and gendered ways in the bodies of people whose nutritional capacity is constantly undermined. It shows up as stunting, it shows up as intellectual incapacity, and it shows up in other strange ways that we are only now beginning to understand, because none of us really knows that much about the connections between malnutrition, toxicity, and impaired human well-being. Except that there are some longitudinal studies on this issue that you might not know about. Because after the Europeans went to war with themselves and the rest of the world in 1939 to 1945, they discovered, 70 odd years later in doing this research, that the results of starvation in pregnancy are epigenetic. They do not stop in the lifetime of the mother or the infant that she gives birth to. And when that infant grows and themselves wishes to have children, the effects of their mother's starvation will come through in their own health. We know this because we know about increases in obesity. We know about increases in heart disease. There are several indicators that we know about. This is not an issue about which we are ignorant while we allow the military occupier to deny food to people. So in addition to everything that you will have harrowingly endured watching, in addition to everything that people have told you about limbless babies who never even learned how to stretch those little limbs of theirs before they were torn from their bodies, in addition to everything we know about the difficulties of giving birth in a genocide, we now also have to face the harrowing and horrifying reality that the ICJ case that the South African government so powerfully and wonderfully took in January to the International Court, in which the fifth of their 5 pleas is about the prevention of Palestinian births, is not contained to the immediacy of this horrifying attack that we're seeing now. We are collectively looking at the perpetration of probably another century of violence, and it will show through the reproductive lack of well-being of all the Palestinians in Gaza who have been subjected to the bioaccumulation of toxins, to starvation, to fear, to the loss of their reproductive capacities. I find this so painful to think about that I can barely bring myself to speak to you. Because how do we communicate this to Palestinians themselves? People have begun to understand, they recognize, they know quite a bit about what it feels like to inhale white phosphorus. They know quite a bit about what it is to have had a child in 2011. This is the first cohort of children where we started to see the birth defects coming through from the attacks of Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 9. What does it feel like to be the mother of a child who has been impaired by war, who you have faithfully attempted to look after, when your child cannot be cared for any longer, when the basic health services on which you rely are no longer available to you, when you cannot look after a person who didn't ever have a chance at a good life? What does it feel like to you when all of the work that you've done over centuries, over hundreds of years, and believe me, this is a strange thing for a South African to think about, but one of the most fascinating moments of my life in Gaza is looking at these incredible ancient archaeological ruins. It dates back to Phoenician times. The aquifer that has collapsed, the coastal aquifer that has collapsed now completely, but really had collapsed by the end of Operation Cast Lead, is so important in the region for its fresh water that it is written about in Egyptian scripts from 3,000 years ago as the place of sweet waters. Before the military occupation, Gaza was a place of trees. Palestine was one of the places that exported oranges around the world. These are indigenous fruits. There was a vast and incredible number of carefully cultivated fruit trees, the last of which were uprooted deliberately in 2008 and 9 in Operation Cast Lead, and which have never been allowed to regrow. Even before October 7th, Gaza was strangely somewhat food sufficient. There were enough fruits and vegetables being supplied by the farmers who have managed to hold on to their land and have managed to deal with saline soils and increasingly polluted water, and to deal with the Israeli occupation's favorite trick of releasing herbicides just at the border on days when the wind is blowing west, so that the crops will be devastated. Somehow Gaza had managed to stay food secure. And somehow Gazans had managed to keep having babies that they could care for. And that, all of that, every piece of that now would appear to be gone. We do not know what the lasting impacts are of soils and waters, of having thousands of 2,000-pound bombs thrown into them. We do not know what is in those craters. We do not know what will happen now that the Blockade seed bank, the second of the seed banks Palestine used to own, has been destroyed. We do not know what will happen now that all of those who migrated, and astoundingly and amazingly, nobody left home, nobody left the north of Gaza without her jar of seeds. Those who are farmers take their seeds with them. And somehow Gaza managed to get through that last harrowing winter, that first harrowing winter, because many of those who carried their seeds planted those seeds around their tents and managed to feed communities. You'll have heard this nonsensical claim that people are eating grass in the northern part of Gaza. But talking to the agroecologists that I work with, they can tell you that these are Baladi foods. These are people who know how to eat from the landscape, even in these terrible, terrible circumstances. And all of this ancient, beautiful land is now polluted, toxified in ways that we cannot understand. The Mediterranean Sea, the hottest of our bodies of water, It's full of military toxins. In our hundreds, in our millions, we're all Palestinians. In our millions and our billions, we're all Palestinians, because those toxins do not leave this earth. We are, all of us, affected by this horror right in our own somatic beings, in our own bodies, because we are all breathing the same air. And we must bring an end to the fact, as Max Le Boiron so beautifully says it, that pollution is colonialism. We need to make this stop. Fossil fuels are the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is fossil fuels. And our own human bodies cannot take any more of this. Please don't be swayed by the right-wing argument that we are an overcrowded planet, that we are too many, and that our numbers are increasing. This is not true. Mammalian fertility is declining at an astounding and horrifying and terrifying rate. And everything that we do to Palestinians, to Sudanese, to Congolese, to Myanmar, to all the bodies of all the suffering humans out there will have epigenetic, in other words, cross-generational effects. What is happening in Palestine today is not going to leave this earth for at least 100 years. And we do not currently have the knowledge or the capacity to clean up what is being done. So, I will leave you there. I'm willing to take any questions if anyone has any. This is a very difficult subject, I think, to talk about, because it's very difficult to bring this pain into our intimate bodies. And I'm sure that there are many people here today who have children, or who wish to have children, or who have not been able to have children, who will feel the sadness of what I say. The prevention of Palestinian births is not just something of this war. This is a very, very, very long, arduous, and frightening place that we're in. And we are in uncharted territories as humans. We don't know what we're doing.